What's going on, guys? My name is Batsy and welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to be picking the best and worst social links from every Persona game. Now, obviously I can't actually do it from every Persona game because neither 1 or 2 have social links, so the list will only be based from 3 to 5. I consider just taking a best and worst character from 1 and 2 instead, just to include them, but I mean, what am I even doing at that point? So, without further ado, let's get on to my picks. Akinari Kamiki's social link begins when you find him sitting alone at the shrine. From the start, Akinari is a soft-spoken, polite, and visibly frail man. He tells you early on that he's sick, and it becomes clear that his illness isn't temporary. This immediately sets the tone for the entire social link. There's no mystery about what's happening here, no dramatic reveal. Instead, the story is about how someone lives when they already know their time is limited. As the ranks progress, Akinari opens up about his love of books and stories, especially a fantasy story he's trying to write. He talks about themes of legacy and memory and what it means to leave something behind after you're gone. But these conversations aren't framed as tragic monologues. They're reflective and thoughtful, often surprisingly warm. The protagonist's role here is simple but important. You listen, you encourage him, and you validate his desire to create something meaningful, even if it won't change his fate. Midway through the social link, Akinari begins sharing more about his family, particularly his relationship with his mother. He worries about how his illness is affecting her, and whether she understands him as a person rather than just someone she needs to protect. This becomes one of the emotional cores of his social link. His writing project starts to reflect these feelings, evolving from abstract fantasy ideas into something more personal. Through these conversations, you see Akinari slowly come to terms more and more with life as it is, rather than just what it could have been. In the later ranks, Akinari's health visibly worsens. His dialogue becomes more introspective, but never bitter. Instead, there's a growing sense of acceptance. He finishes his story, framing it as something that will outlast him, a piece of him that can continue to exist even when he can't. One of the most powerful moments in the social link comes when he expresses gratitude, not for being saved or fixed, but simply for being listened to and understood. The protagonist doesn't change his fate or save him, and that's exactly why the arc works. In the final rank, after saying his goodbyes to the protagonist, Akinari disappears, likely meaning he passed away very shortly after the completion of his book. His mother later gives the protagonist his completed story, revealing how much the conversations they shared meant to him and how deeply they helped him to truly articulate his feelings. There's no melodrama, no last-minute twists, just quiet. The social link, despite the heavy tragedy, ends not with despair, but with a sense of meaning, reinforcing the idea that even a short life can have purpose if it's honestly lived. And what makes Akinari's social link the best in Persona 3 is how complete and intentional his arc feels, and how it perfectly encapsulates everything that Persona 3 stands for. Every conversation builds towards a clear emotional endgame. The protagonist's role isn't to fix him or rescue him, but to bear witness to his thoughts, encourage his creative expression, and give him the strength to keep going and valuing his time while he's still around. It's a social link that doesn't need to have some bombastic set piece to be memorable. It leaves a long-lasting impression on you through deep emotional conversation, and I think those moments are what really make social links so good. Now, on the complete other side of the spectrum, we have Nozomi Suemitsu. There's definitely a few choices in Persona 3 for the worst, and I even consider putting Bebe on here, as his social link is a complete nothing burger. But even with how annoying Bebe is, he's nowhere close to the level Suemitsu reaches at times. Suemitsu's social link starts as a complete joke, and unfortunately it never really fully recovers from that first impression. When you meet him, he introduces himself as the Gourmet King, a guy whose entire identity just revolves around food. He talks constantly about eating, hoarding food, and craving more than he can possibly consume. And at first, it's just framed as comedic, an exaggerated, goofy personality meant to stand out. But even in these early ranks, there's already a problem. There's no emotional hook. You're not being invited to his personal story, you're just being asked to tolerate this guy. As the social link continues, the conversations don't deepen so much as they just repeat. Nozomi keeps talking about hunger, food, and consumption, but the game doesn't yet give us a reason to care. Sure, there are hints that his obsession isn't healthy, but instead of slowly unpacking that idea, the social link just stalls. You're spending time with him, but nothing is really being built. Compare this to some of the stronger social links that establish a clear emotional direction early on. Here, you're several ranks in, and you're still waiting for the story to start. Then, midway through the social link, the narrative abruptly pivots. Nozomi reveals that he is in a fucking cult. I'm 100% serious. One that's exploiting his insecurities and promising him status and belonging. And on paper, this should be the turning point, the moment where everything clicks and this earlier behavior isn't excused but elaborated on. But the problem is the timing and the execution. This reveal comes completely out of nowhere without any proper build-up, and it's resolved almost as quickly as it's introduced. Instead of feeling like a natural escalation of his issues, it feels like the social link panicking near the end and forcing some dramatic stake. And worse, the protagonist's role during this stretch is almost completely non-existent. And this is a trend you'll start to see in a lot of the worst social links in each game. You don't meaningfully challenge Nozomi's beliefs at all, and any form of criticism to his way of thought results in less points towards leveling the social link, meaning you have to actively entertain his delusions just to continue his link. A social link is supposed to be about mutual interaction and growth, but here the players are reduced to just a spectator, just watching a subplot unfold and agreeing with every little thing he has to say. Later ranks finally attempt to give Nozomi some emotional depth by introducing his family's history. history. He talks about being constantly compared to a successful brother and feeling like he was never able to measure up. And this is the first time the social link offers a genuinely human explanation for all of his behavior. His obsession with food is reframed as an emotional hunger, a desire to fill a void left by neglect and insecurity. The problem is this comes in way too late for me to care at all. This feels less like a vulnerable moment for Soemitsu and more like the writers desperately trying to make us give a shit about him. Instead of letting this revelation recontextualize the earlier ranks, the social link just rushes towards a conclusion because it wasted so much time in the beginning on comedic relief. Nozomi has a sudden realization that his lifestyle and mindset have been unhealthy and he expresses a desire to change. But because the player hasn't helped him reach this conclusion at all, there's no gradual transformation, no series of small behavioral changes that demonstrate his growth. He just simply arrives at the answer completely on his own, and then the social link ends. By the final rank, you're left with the sense that Nozomi's arc had the components to be a good social link, but it was just never assembled correctly. The early ranks waste so much time on repetitive humor, the middle ranks introduce high-stakes drama without proper build-up, and the late ranks just dump a bunch of emotional context too quickly to have impact. At no point does the protagonist feel essential to Nozomi's growth, and without reciprocal connection, the social link fails at its core purpose. What makes Nozomi's social link so disappointing isn't even that he's just annoying, it's that it consistently misses opportunities to be meaningful. And when you compare that disjointed experience to the quiet, deliberate progression of someone like Akinari's social link, the difference in quality becomes increasingly impossible to ignore. Ku's social link Persona 4 starts quietly, but with an immediate sense that there's more going on beneath the surface. On the basketball court, Ku comes off as extremely reserved and disciplined, the opposite of Daisuke's loud impulsiveness. He doesn't talk much about himself at first, and when he does, it's carefully measured. Right away, the social link establishes something important. Ku is someone who keeps things bottled up, not because he's shy, but because he's learned that speaking up doesn't always matter. As you spend more time with him, the real source of that restraint becomes clear. Ku belongs to the house of Ichijo, a long-established and highly traditional family in Inaba. His home life is dominated by strict customs, tea ceremonies, rigid expectations, and an almost suffocating revere for tradition. The family is ruled by his grandmother, who acts as the de facto head of the household and enforces those traditions without compromise. And Ku's grandma doesn't just dislike basketball, she calls it barbaric, something unworthy of the Ichijo name. This early revelation immediately gives Ku's conflict real weight. His problem isn't teenage angst or uncertainty, it's living in a household that fundamentally rejects the very thing that he uses to feel like himself. Ku then reveals the detail that complicates everything. He was adopted. His adoptive parents had no heirs, so he was brought into the family to carry on the Ichijo name, only for his adoptive mother to later give birth to a biological daughter. Ku initially treats this like a loophole. Since his sister is the blood relative, the burden of inheritance would fall on her, meaning Ku would be free to live whatever life he wants to. But as the social link progresses, it becomes more obvious that he doesn't really feel free at all. Instead, he feels quietly discarded. He's relieved to escape responsibility, yet deeply hurt by the idea that he was so easily replaced. The social link doesn't dramatize this. It lets the contradiction sit there uncomfortably, which makes it painfully real. The emotional conflict starts bleeding into basketball itself. Ku becomes distant, skips practice, and when he does show up, he's completely checked out, spacing out so badly he doesn't even realize practice has ended. This is one of the strongest moments of the social link because it shows the consequences of repression rather than just telling us about them. Ku isn't lazy or disinterested, he's exhausted from carrying an identity that he doesn't understand anymore. Daisuke's plan to reignite Ku's interests, blackmailing teammates into setting up a match, is stupid in a very Persona 4 way, but it serves as an important narrative function. When the protagonist and Daisuke invite Ku to play, Ku is genuinely surprised, and when they lose the match, something just clicks for him. He doesn't feel embarrassed or defeated, he feels relieved. For the first time in a while, basketball isn't tied to expectation, rebellion, or obligation. It's just something he did with the people who care about him. That relief matters more than winning ever could, and the social link makes this distinction crystal clear. With that pressure lifted, Ku decides to confront another unresolved part of his identity, his origins. Since the mask he's been wearing is gone, he feels ready to search for his real parents. When he visits the orphanage, however, he receives a letter that is supposedly written by them. The letter reveals that his biological parents died long ago from an illness, and that the name Ku, meaning healthy, wasn't chosen as a wish for success, but rather something more simple, that he would live a healthy and strong life and avoid the suffering that they had to endure. This moment is quietly devastating, not because it's tragic, but because it reframes everything Ku thought his life needed to be about. At first, Ku accepts the letter at face value, but his doubt creeps back in. He notices the smug signature and realizes the letter may not have been written by his real parents at all, but rather the orphanage's matron. And instead of turning this into a cheap twist, the social link does something far more mature. Ku realizes that maybe the literal truth doesn't matter as much as he thought. What defines him isn't bloodlines, names, or expectations, but it's the bonds that he's formed with others. This is the emotional thesis of the entire social link, and it lands because everything leading up to it has been about identity imposed versus identity chosen. By the final ranks, Ku confronts his adoptive parents, directly asking them the question he's been afraid to in this entire time, whether they actually see him him as their son or just a replacement. Their answer is simple. They truly care for him and they want to see him pursue what he genuinely desires. This moment completes Ku's arc, not by rejecting his family, but by finally reconciling with them on honest terms. He decides not to pursue basketball professionally, choosing instead to study overseas and eventually help his family in his own way. It's a decision rooted in self-understanding, not obligation or rebellion. When Ku gives the protagonist the orphanage letter at the end, asking him to hold on to it until he can stand on his own feet, it feels earned. That letter becomes a symbol of everything he's learned. That identity isn't something you inherit or you're assigned, but something shaped through connection, choice, and trust. What makes Ku's social link one of the best in Persona 4 is how tightly it's constructed. Every phase builds naturally on the last. His family background informs his insecurity, his insecurity drains his passion, and eventually, clarity comes not from dramatic confrontation, but from honest reflection and genuine bonds. The protagonist isn't a passive listener, they're a constant presence, helping Ku articulate his thoughts that he's never been allowed to voice before. And when you compare this to weaker social links that waste time, rush revelations, or sideline the player entirely, Ku's arc stands out as thoughtful, cohesive, and deeply human. Now, Ayane, on the other hand, is literally the complete opposite. You meet her through the music club and immediately she's framed as a shy, insecure, and painfully self-conscious person. She talks quietly, avoids eye contact, and is constantly apologizing. And on paper, this is fertile ground for a solid character arc. Someone with low self-esteem slowly finding confidence through personal connection. The problem is that the social link never commits to really doing that. Early ranks establish Ayane's defining trait. She hates herself. She constantly puts herself down, compares herself to others, and assumes that everyone around her is constantly judging her. And unlike some of the stronger social links in this game, the game doesn't really challenge this mindset, it reinforces it. Your dialogue options overwhelmingly push you towards reassuring her in the most surface level way possible. You're not helping her unpack why she feels this way, you're just telling her she'll be fine and moving on. Right out of the gate, the social link confuses emotional validation with emotional development. As the ranks progress, Ayane's anxiety doesn't evolve, it just loops into different avenues. She worries about her music ability, she's worried about letting people down, she worries about being embarrassed, and then she worries about worrying too much. The conversations just blur together because there's nothing really meaningful changing. Unlike Ku and Daisuke, where each rank builds on the last and their flawed mindset is actively challenged, Ayane's social link just keeps restating the same insecurity with slightly different phrasing. You're spending time with her, but you're not moving anywhere. Midway through the social link, the game introduces conflict in the form of her feelings about the music club and her place in it. Ayane believes she's dragging the whole group down, that she just doesn't deserve to be there, and everyone would be better off without her. And this should be the turning point, where her destructive thoughts are confronted and reframed. Instead, the social link once again just asks the player to gently reassure her and move on. There's no challenge, no friction, no pushback. You're not helping her grow, you're just acting as an emotional pacifier. And what makes this especially frustrating is that Persona 4 knows how to write insecurity well. We just talked about how complex Ku and his emotions are. He's insecure about his place in the world because of a substantial amount of trauma in his life, and by the end of his link, he learns to come to terms with the reason he was feeling this way. Ayane, however, has never really allowed that level of complexity. Her negative self-image is just treated as something to be soothed rather than examined. The game never asks her to interrogate where these feelings come from or how they might be overcome. Later ranks attempt to move Ayane towards confidence by having her perform and acknowledge that she enjoys music despite her fears. Rather than her not being afraid anymore because she's been able to confront why, she's not afraid anymore because now she sees that she had talent for music all along. By the final ranks, Ayane expresses that she feels more confident and grateful for the time that she spent with the protagonist. And while that sentiment is fine on its own, it's completely disconnected and unearned from the experience of actually playing through the social link. The arc tells you she's grown, but it never shows you how. The protagonist hasn't challenged her worldview or helped her reframe her identity in a meaningful way. You didn't help her become stronger, you just listened while the game insisted that was enough. By the time the social link ends, Ayane's story feels less like a completed character arc and more like a missed opportunity. The setup is solid, the theme is relatable, but the execution refuses to engage with conflict of any meaningful way. The early ranks repeat themselves, the middle ranks stall, and the ending implies growth without really earning it. And crucially, the protagonist once again feels non-essential, interchangeable with any vaguely supportive presence. What makes Ayane's social link so weak isn't that she's annoying or malicious, it's just that it's complete nothing burger. Nothing you do meaningfully alters the trajectory of her character. In a game where the best social links thrive on confrontation, reflection, and incremental change, Ayane's arc settles for comfort and reassurance, which feels like a direct contradiction of the message of Persona 4. And when you place that next to deliberate, emotionally structured arcs of characters like Ku, the contrast makes her social link feel less like a character study and more like filler content that just never justified its runtime. Now, before I begin with Persona 5, I want to touch on a few things. Firstly, this game introduced the idea of social links providing useful passive skills for completing them. However, I won't be taking any of these into consideration when ranking them to keep it consistent with the other games. And secondly, this game begins calling social links confidants, and even though that's an objectively cooler name, I'm a stubborn bitch, so I'm going to keep calling them social links. And lastly, I have to preface my selection by saying this. I will not be counting Maruki as a part of my ranking in this game. And honestly, it's just because it would be genuinely unfair to every other social link in this game because his social link has the most development and an entire semester arc of payoff. If you're really curious, obviously, yes, it would be number 1, but for the sake of giving other links more of a chance, I'm going to be skipping it. So moving on to my actual selection, the Hermit, Futaba Sakura. Futaba's confidant in Persona 5 starts from an unusually grounded place for this game. When her social link begins, Futaba is technically already saved, but she still isn't exactly functional. She barely leaves her room, panics in public spaces, struggles to speak to strangers, and relies heavily on the protagonist as a social anchor. This is not about fixing her trauma all at once, it's about learning how to exist again in a world that still feels hostile. And this is exactly why it ranks as my favorite in Persona 5, while Ayane is my least favorite in Persona 4, despite them touching on extremely similar subject matters. The early ranks are deliberately uncomfortable the moment this social link starts. She's anxious, defensive, and awkward to be around. She speaks in half-finished thoughts, hides behind jokes and gamer slang, and frequently shuts down when she gets overwhelmed. And crucially, the game doesn't treat this as a phase to rush through. She presents the protagonist with a list of things she wants to accomplish, and these early interactions are small, almost mundane steps forward, going outside, making eye contact, talking to shop clerks. The social link understands that recovery isn't a montage, it's incremental exposure. What immediately sets Futaba apart from the weaker social links is the protagonist is actively involved in every single step of this progression. You're not just listening to her problems, you're participating in every attempt to overcome them. When she wants to go outside, you go with her. When she wants to try socializing, you're her safety net. The game consistently frames Joker not as a therapist or savior, but as a stabilizing and calming, consistent presence. Someone who gives her the confidence to try, fail, and try again. Midway through the social link, Futaba's anxiety doesn't just disappear, it simply just changes shape. She becomes more willing to put herself in uncomfortable situations, but she still struggles with self-doubt and fear of regression. This is an important distinction. The social link doesn't treat her growth as linear. She still has moments where she backslides, panics, or questions whether she's actually getting better. And instead of undoing her progress, the social link treats these moments as part of the process. One of the strongest aspects of Futaba's social link is how it externalizes her growth through action rather than self-congratulation. She doesn't just say she's stronger, she demonstrates it. She starts going out on her own, she talks to people without Joker prompting her to, and begins making decisions independently, even when she's scared. These changes aren't announced, they're shown through subtle shifts in her behavior and dialogue, which makes them feel earned. Near the end of the link, Futaba's arc pivots towards responsibility. She takes on the final goal of her list and attempts to save her friend Kana from an abusive situation with her parents. And this is where the social link quietly proves its point. Futaba isn't becoming brave because the world has stopped being scary. She's becoming brave despite it. It shows the progress she's made by not only showing that she's become strong enough to speak out on her own, but also to help others. The protagonist's role here remains consistent to the very end. You don't solve the problem for her. You support her, encourage her, and trust her to take the lead, and that trust is what allows her to grow. By the final ranks, Futaba isn't fixed, but she is self-sufficient. She understands her limits, acknowledges her anxiety, and still chooses to move forward. That distinction is what makes her link feel authentic rather than idealized. What makes Futaba's social link the best in Persona 5 isn't that it's the most dramatic or tragic, it's that it understands recovery as a process. It respects the idea that personal growth takes time, effort, and support, and it structures the entire social link around that truth. And when you compare that level of care and intentionality to weaker links that either rush the development or silence the player entirely, Futaba's arc stands out as what every good social link should strive to be. And finally, the worst confidant in Persona 5 is, of course, Ohya. Mishima, you're a close second, but Ohya just barely beats him out. Ohya's confidant in Persona 5 starts off on the wrong foot, and it never really recovers. From the moment you meet her, she's defined almost entirely by cynicism, and is permanently parked in a bar complaining about the world while doing nothing meaningful to change her place in it. The game frames her as a fallen journalist, but instead of using that as a lens to explore failure or self-reflection, the social link treats her stagnation as a personality quirk you expect to tolerate. Early ranks establish the core problem immediately. Ohya drinks, insults people around her, and positions herself as someone who's above it all just because she's already been burned once. There's no vulnerability here, no visible internal conflict, just smug resignation. And worse, the link never challenges this mindset. You're not asked to question her bitterness or call out on her self-destructive behavior, you're asked to sit there and listen and enable it. As you keep spending time with her, the conversations loop in the most unproductive way possible. She complains about her editor, she complains about the industry, she complains about corruption, but none of this deepens or evolves, it just piles up. The link tells you what happened to her in broad strokes, but it never contemplates how that failure shaped her or what she's done since. Her disillusionment is treated as a finished state, not something that needs unpacking or resolution. And the protagonist's role during all of this is borderline insulting. Any dialogue choice that questions Ohya's attitude or suggests personal responsibility tends to really stall progress, while options that affirm her cynicism are rewarded. The game actively trains you to agree with everything she says, no matter how stagnant or self-indulgent she's being. Instead of a relationship built on growth, the social link becomes a feedback loop where the player's job is to validate her worst instincts. Midway through the link, the story pretends to raise the stakes by reintroducing her old investigation. She starts chasing leads again, digging into corruption and power structures, but even here, the focus is never on her internal struggle. Events simply happen off screen, and she reports back to you afterward. There's no fear of failure, no reckoning with past mistakes, and no meaningful decision making that help you guide. The arc moves forward mechanically, not emotionally. What makes this especially frustrating is how little Ohya herself changes throughout this process. She doesn't grow more reflective, she doesn't become more self-aware, she doesn't meaningfully evolve as a person, she just becomes slightly more active while retaining the same smug, condescending worldview she started with. The social link confuses movement with development, as if doing something automatically counts as growth. By the final rank, the game insists that Ohya has rediscovered her drive as a journalist, but nothing in the actual link interactions support that claim. There's no gradual rebuilding of confidence, no internal conflict that gets resolved, and no sense that the protagonist mattered in getting her there. You didn't help her change, you just watched her continue being herself with marginally better circumstances. What makes Ohya's social link so bad isn't just that she's unpleasant to spend time with, it's that the game refuses to engage with her flaws in any meaningful way. She's static from beginning to end, and the player is never allowed to push back. In a series where the best social links thrive on confrontation and honest reflection, Ohya's confidant feels hollow and inert. Her link is a perfect example of a poor choice in design philosophy for some of the worst social links. The protagonist is passive, disagreement is punished, and character growth is something the game declares rather than earns. Compared to Futaba's tightly structured, player-driven arc, Ohya's link actively undermines what makes social links compelling in the first place. And that's it. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give me a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. I wanted to try something new here, and I couldn't find anyone else on Persona YouTube making a ranking like this, so I figured I'd give it a try and maybe be a little unique. I also plan on making a series of ranking each social link in each game, so if that interests you, stay tuned for that. I also just wanted to say a small thank you for how well my channel has done this year. I wanted to get back into making videos just here and there for fun, but I didn't really think anyone would watch them or really care about them. So the fact that my Persona videos have a collective of over 10,000 views is just wild to see. I wanted to put out one more video before the end of the year for you guys, but hopefully I'll be a little more consistent in 2026. But that's all for me. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.